October, the day of Yom Kippur. The phone rang at the home of Israel's military chief, General David Elazar. Elazar had been made Israeli Chief of Staff after a long military career and a host of victories. The call from Israeli military intelligence informed him that both Egypt and Syria would launch an attack in hours. Elazar's immediate thought was to send his air force to hit the Arabs before they had a chance to strike. But that decision could only be taken in the halls of power by Israel's politicians, and ultimately that meant one person, Israel's Prime Minister, Golda Meir. This 75-year-old was seen as the Iron Lady of Israeli politics, but she said no to airstrikes. She argued that if Israel was to win international support after the Six-Day War, it had to be seen not as the aggressor, but the victim. Elazar was appalled at his leader's reaction. He was only given permission to mobilize a fraction of the reservists he needed, and yet, within a few hours, his country would face invasion on two fronts. Egypt and Syria were poised to launch their attack.
Just before 2 o'clock, the Egyptians put their part of the plan into action. Their assault across the canal on the forts of the Bar Lev line was such a momentous event in Egyptian history, it was later restaged for the cameras. Thousands of Egypt's best-trained commandos crossed the Suez Canal in rubber dinghies. They landed on the east bank in the gaps between the forts of the Bar Lev line. The Egyptian commandos then scrambled up the high sand ramparts. They attached rope ladders to make it easier for the soldiers following on behind them. Behind this first wave were 100,000 Egyptian infantry and more than 1,000 tanks waiting to cross the canal, but the biggest obstacle to them were the giant sand ramparts on the Israeli side. These were as much as 60 feet in height. It was impossible for the Egyptian tanks and heavy artillery to climb up and over them. The Egyptians experimented with using dynamite to blow holes in them, but this was found to take far too long. But then one junior engineer officer had a flash of genius. He suggested using high-pressure hoses to blast the ramparts with water from the canal. It was an extraordinary idea which would have to work if the entire Egyptian assault was to be a success. 4 hours into the attack, and with fighting raging around them, the Egyptian engineers finally broke through the ramparts, and the first tanks started to pour through.
I never believed I would see the day when I was in Sinai. But this was actually Sinai. I looked back at the West Bank and all the green on the other side, and to the east, all I could see is desert. It was good feeling.
The eastern bank of the canal now became a battlefield. The Israelis manning the forts sprayed machine gun fire at their Egyptian attackers to try and stem the tide. But within 2 hours, 23,000 of Egypt's infantry were on the east bank and had advanced up to 1 mile into Sinai.
The fort was surrounded by Egyptian forces and was under constant fire. We made repeated calls for help. We fired from time to time and reported back what we saw. But mainly, we tried to keep up our morale.
But the Israelis were sure that their air force would come to the rescue. The first Israeli jets were sent in at 4 p.m., flying low over the desert. But as they approached the canal, they found themselves under attack from the ground. The Egyptian SAM missiles and anti-aircraft guns caused havoc. As Israeli planes were shot down that afternoon, it soon became clear that Egypt's elaborate air defense umbrella was working. Israel's single greatest weapon, its air force, was virtually powerless to hold back the Egyptian onslaught. The most immediate hope for the Israelis surrounded in the forts were Israeli tanks stationed just a few miles away.
The Israeli tanks raced towards the canal. They thought they'd throw the Egyptians back as easily as they had done in 1967. But as they got closer, they found themselves coming under attack from a weapon they'd never faced before. The Saga missile. This Soviet-made weapon was specifically designed to punch through the thick metal armor of tanks. Yet it was small enough to be carried onto the battlefield in a backpack. Unlike bigger anti-tank guns, the Saga could be set up in moments. This lightweight piece of kit was made all the more lethal because the missile could be steered onto its target. 1973, the Saga was turning the Sinai into a tank graveyard. The tanks, which were the pride of Israel's army, were being destroyed by Egyptian infantrymen. Israel had begun the war with around 300 tanks in Sinai. By the end of the first 36 hours, they'd lost approximately half of this number. Things were critical for the Israeli soldiers in Sinai.